Dr. Thomas Mitchell froze mid-step on his porch, the morning coffee mug slipping from his weathered fingers and shattering against the wooden planks. Three massive black bears stood at his fence line, their dark eyes fixed on him with an intensity that defied every rule of wildlife behavior he'd learned in 40 years of veterinary practice. They weren't growling. They weren't retreating. They were bowing their heads. Deputy Sarah Chen's radio crackled from her patrol car at the property entrance, her voice barely a whisper. "Sheriff, you need to see this. The bears. They're not acting like bears." Behind her, neighbor Margaret Sullivan pressed trembling hands against her kitchen window, remembering the three tiny cubs that had once played in Thomas's barn 15 years ago, cubs that should have forgotten him long ago. "Nobody move," Thomas commanded, though his own heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. Who were these giants, and why had they come home? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The story began 15 years ago when Dr. Thomas Mitchell still believed in second chances and before grief had carved permanent lines around his blue eyes. At 72 now, he carried himself with the careful dignity of a man who had lost everything that mattered twice. First his daughter Sarah in a senseless car accident, then his beloved wife Eleanor to cancer 3 winters past. The 40-acre property in Glacier Ridge, Montana had become both his sanctuary and his prison, a place where memories lived in every corner, but hope had long since departed. Thomas had been one of the region's most respected veterinarians before retirement forced him into a quieter existence. His hands, still steady despite arthritis, bore the scars of countless animal rescues, bite marks from frightened dogs, claw scratches from feral cats, and one particularly memorable scar from a wounded hawk that Eleanor had nursed back to health in their kitchen. Those hands now shook slightly as he counted pills each morning, rationing his heart medication to stretch his dwindling pension another month. The financial reality was brutal and unspoken. Property taxes had tripled since the area became fashionable with wealthy retirees from California. Medical bills from Eleanor's final months had drained their savings, and the insurance company had found creative ways to deny coverage for experimental treatments. Thomas faced a choice that haunted his sleepless nights. Sell the land Eleanor had loved, or lose it to foreclosure. Either way, he would die in some sterile assisted living facility, forgotten and purposeless. 2 miles down the winding mountain road lived Margaret Sullivan, a woman who understood loneliness as intimately as Thomas understood loss. At 68, she maintained her small ranch with the fierce independence of someone who had buried her husband 5 years earlier and discovered that widowhood meant becoming invisible in a world designed for couples. Her days followed a rigid routine: morning chores, afternoon reading, evening television, each activity a bulwark against the silence that threatened to swallow her whole. Margaret had been a registered nurse before marriage, her capable hands equally skilled at delivering babies and comforting the dying. She possessed an innate understanding of suffering that drew wounded creatures to her door like a beacon. Stray cats, injured birds, and even the occasional lost deer had found sanctuary in her barn over the years. Yet for all her nurturing instincts, she had never been blessed with children of her own, an emptiness that echoed through her too-quiet house. The two neighbors maintained a cordial but distant relationship, exchanging waves across their shared fence line and occasional pleasantries at the general store in town. Both were too proud to admit their desperate loneliness, too stubborn to reach across the void that separated them. They were two souls living parallel lives of quiet desperation, unaware that fate was about to thrust them together in ways neither could imagine. On that May morning 15 years ago, Thomas had no idea that his life was about to change forever. He certainly never expected that salvation would come in the form of 3 orphaned bear cubs. The morning of May 15th began like any other, with Thomas nursing his second cup of coffee on the wraparound porch Eleanor had insisted they build for their retirement years. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and the distant promise of summer wildflowers, but Thomas barely noticed. His attention was fixed on the certified letter from First Montana Bank, its contents as cold and final as a death sentence. 60 days to bring his mortgage current or face foreclosure proceedings. He was folding the letter with hands that trembled more from rage than age when he heard it, a sound that pierced through his self-pity like a knife through silk. It was crying, but not human crying. This was the desperate, heartbreaking wail of something young and terrified, calling for a mother who would never answer. Thomas followed the sound across his property. Past the vegetable garden Eleanor had planted their first spring here, beyond the old oak where they'd scattered their daughter's ashes 20 years ago. The crying grew louder as he approached the tree line where his land met the vast wilderness of Glacier National Park. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his days. A female black bear lay motionless among the fallen pine needles, her glossy coat matted with dried blood from a bullet wound to her chest. But it wasn't the sight of the dead mother that stopped Thomas's breath. It was the 3 tiny cubs huddled against her still warm body, their mouths open in pitiful cries that seemed to echo through the entire forest. The cubs couldn't have been more than 6 weeks old, their eyes barely open, their fur still bearing the soft fuzziness of extreme youth. They were so small that Thomas could have held all 3 in his arms, yet they displayed a heartbreaking loyalty to their mother, refusing to venture more than inches from her side despite their obvious hunger and thirst. Thomas knelt beside them, his veterinary training automatically cataloging their condition: dehydrated, malnourished, and probably hypothermic from spending the night in the cold mountain air. The largest cub, a male with distinctive dark markings around his eyes, looked up at Thomas with an expression that seemed almost human in its desperation. In that moment, something shifted in the old man's chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since Eleanor's final breath. The practical side of his mind, the part trained by decades of protocol and procedure, insisted he should call Fish and Wildlife immediately. These were wild animals, and there were proper channels for handling orphaned wildlife. But the compassionate side, the part that had driven him to become a veterinarian in the first place, saw only 3 babies who would die without immediate intervention. Thomas knew the regional rehabilitation centers were overcrowded, understaffed, and facing budget cuts. He also knew that bear cubs this young had a survival rate of less than 30% in captivity. As he watched the smallest cub, barely larger than a house cat, struggle to stay upright on wobbly legs, the decision made itself. "I'm sorry, Mama," he whispered to the dead bear, gently closing her glassy eyes. "I'll take care of your babies." Gathering the cubs proved easier than expected. They were too weak to resist, and seemed to instinctively understand that this large, gentle creature meant them no harm. Thomas tucked them inside his jacket, feeling their tiny hearts beating against his chest like trapped birds. The largest cub, whom he immediately thought of as Rex, managed a small snuffle before falling asleep against Thomas's warm body. The walk back to the house felt like a pilgrimage. With each step, Thomas felt purpose returning to his movements, a sense of mission he hadn't experienced since Eleanor's diagnosis. These cubs needed him in a way no one had needed him for years. They didn't care about his mounting debts, or his creaking joints, or his frequent conversations with photographs of the dead. They needed only the most basic things: warmth, food, safety, and love. It was Margaret who found him in his kitchen an hour later, having arrived to deliver a casserole she'd made with the excuse of clearing out her freezer. She stopped in the doorway, her mouth falling open at the sight of Thomas bottle-feeding a bear cub, while 2 others slept in a makeshift nest of towels on his kitchen table. "Thomas Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying equal parts shock and admiration, "what on earth have you done?" Thomas looked up at her, and for the first time in months, Margaret saw something in his eyes besides grief and resignation. It was hope, fragile as spun glass but unmistakably present. "I've found a reason to live," he said simply, then held out the bottle to the second cub, who immediately began nursing with desperate enthusiasm. "Margaret, meet Rex, Luna, and Scout. They're going to need both of us." Margaret's initial shock gave way to a fierce protectiveness that surprised them both. Within hours, she had transformed Thomas's barn into a proper nursery, complete with heat lamps, soft bedding, and a feeding schedule that would have impressed any pediatric unit. The cubs responded to her maternal touch with an eagerness that made her heart ache with long-suppressed longing. "These babies need feeding every 2 hours," she announced, rolling up her sleeves with the efficiency of someone who had spent 40 years caring for others. "And they'll need special formula. Cow's milk will kill them faster than starvation." Her nursing background proved invaluable as she calculated precise nutritional requirements and monitored the cubs' weight gain with meticulous charts that covered every wall of the barn. Rex, the largest and most protective of the three, quickly established himself as the leader. Even at 6 weeks old, he positioned himself between his siblings and any perceived threat, his tiny growls more endearing than intimidating. Luna, the only female, displayed an insatiable curiosity that led her to investigate every corner of their enclosure with methodical determination. Scout, the smallest and most fragile, possessed an intelligence that seemed almost supernatural. He learned to recognize Thomas's voice from across the property and would cry until the old man appeared. The first month passed in a blur of sleepless nights and constant vigilance. Thomas found himself energized in ways he hadn't experienced since his daughter's childhood, rising before dawn to prepare bottles and check on his charges. Margaret arrived each morning with homemade breakfast and stayed until well past sunset, her own empty house forgotten in the joy of nurturing something that needed her completely. "Look at him," Margaret whispered one evening as Rex carefully groomed Luna's fur while Scout slept between them. "He's trying so hard to be their daddy." The scene tugged at something deep in Thomas's chest, a recognition of responsibility and love that transcended species. But their secret couldn't remain hidden forever. Glacier Ridge was a small community where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the sight of Margaret's car at Thomas's property from dawn to dusk sparked curiosity that soon grew into suspicion. The first real threat came from an unexpected source, Dr. Janet Brooks, a fish and wildlife officer whose by-the-book approach had earned her both respect and resentment throughout the region. "Dr. Mitchell," she said, arriving unannounced on a sweltering July morning, "I've received reports about unusual activity on your property. Mind if I take a look around?" Her tone was professional but firm, and Thomas felt his carefully constructed world begin to crumble. And the cubs were napping in the barn, temporarily out of sight, but their distinctive musky scent hung in the air like evidence waiting to be discovered. Thomas forced his expression into neutrality while his mind raced through possibilities. Lying to a federal officer could result in prison time, but telling the truth meant losing Rex, Luna, and Scout to an overcrowded system that might not keep them alive. "I'm just an old man tending his garden," Thomas replied, gesturing toward Eleanor's flower beds where Margaret was conspicuously pulling weeds. "Nothing unusual about that." But Dr. Brooks had the sharp eyes of someone trained to spot wildlife sign, and her gaze lingered on the modified barn with its new ventilation system and reinforced fencing. The inspection stretched for 3 agonizing hours. Dr. Brooks examined every inch of the property, while Thomas and Margaret maintained forced conversations about weather and local gossip. The cubs, as if sensing danger, remained unusually quiet in their hiding place, but Thomas could see Scout's distinctive ear poking through a gap in the hay bales. "Your barn smells like bear," Dr. Brooks said, finally, her hand resting on the latch that separated discovery from disaster. Want to explain that? Thomas felt Margaret's eyes on him, saw the fear in her expression that mirrored his own. These cubs had become their world, their purpose, their family. Losing them would mean returning to the gray emptiness that had consumed them both before that fateful May morning. "Wild bears come through occasionally," he said, the half-truth burning his throat. "Probably checking for easy meals. I've been meaning to install better deterrents." The lie felt like betrayal, but the alternative was unthinkable. Dr. Brooks studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, unexpectedly, she stepped back from the barn door. "See that you do," she said. "And Dr. Mitchell, if you ever find yourself in possession of wildlife that needs proper care, the Rehabilitation Center in Kalispell has excellent facilities. No questions asked about how they got there." After she left, Thomas and Margaret sat in stunned silence on the porch steps, watching the cubs tumble over each other in their afternoon play session. The message had been clear. Dr. Brooks suspected, but chose not to confirm. They had been given a reprieve, but it came with an expiration date neither wanted to acknowledge. "We can't keep them forever," Margaret said quietly, voicing the truth they'd both been avoiding. "They're getting bigger every day. Soon we won't be able to hide them." Thomas watched Rex demonstrate his growing strength by dragging a fallen branch twice his size across the enclosure. The cub was already showing signs of the massive bear he would become: powerful shoulders, oversized paws, an intelligence that seemed to catalog every detail of his environment. "I know," Thomas admitted, his voice rough with emotion, "but knowing and accepting are two different things." As summer deepened into early fall, the cubs grew at an astonishing rate. They had progressed from bottle feeding to solid foods, from helpless infants to rambunctious juveniles who tested every boundary of their enclosure. Their play had taken on the serious undertones of survival training, with Rex teaching his siblings to fish in the makeshift pond Thomas had constructed, and Luna demonstrating climbing techniques that would serve them well in the wild. But with their growth came an uncomfortable reality. They were becoming bears, not pets, and bears, no matter how beloved, belonged in the wilderness that had shaped their species for millennia. The legal storm broke on a crisp September morning when Sheriff Mike Rodriguez arrived at Thomas's property with a face that could have been carved from granite. Behind him came Dr. Brooks, this time accompanied by two federal marshals whose presence transformed a neighborly visit into something far more ominous. "Thomas," Sheriff Rodriguez said, his voice heavy with regret, "we need to talk. Inside, now." The formal complaint had been filed by Marcus Reed, a local real estate developer whose silver Mercedes looked obscenely out of place against the rustic backdrop of Thomas's property. Reed stood beside his car with the confident posture of a man accustomed to getting his way, his expensive suit and predatory smile marking him as a newcomer to Glacier Ridge's close-knit community. "Gentlemen," Reed said, approaching with practiced charm, "I'm simply concerned about public safety. Keeping dangerous wildlife in a residential area violates multiple federal statutes. Surely we can resolve this in a way that benefits everyone." Thomas felt Margaret's hand slip into his, her fingers cold despite the warm morning air. Through the barn window, he could see Rex pacing restlessly, as if the young bear sensed the tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. The next hours unfolded with the surreal quality of a nightmare. Official documents were produced, charges were read, and the cub's fate was sealed with bureaucratic efficiency that left no room for sentiment or extenuating circumstances. Thomas and Margaret were given 72 hours to surrender the bears to the state rehabilitation facility or face federal prosecution for wildlife trafficking. "This is insane," Margaret protested, her nursing background making her acutely aware of the cubs' medical needs. "They've been hand-raised. They don't know how to be wild bears. You're sentencing them to death. Doctor. Brooks maintained her professional composure, but Thomas caught a flicker of sympathy in her eyes. Ma'am, these animals need to be with their own kind. The Rehabilitation Center has trained professionals who specialize in wild release preparation. Trained professionals? Thomas repeated bitterly. I've been a veterinarian for 40 years. I've raised these cubs from near death to thriving juveniles. What more training do they need? Reed stepped forward with the smooth confidence of a predator moving in for the kill. Dr. Mitchell, I understand your emotional attachment, but we must consider the broader implications. Your property has become a liability to the community. I'm prepared to make you a generous offer that would solve everyone's problems. The offer was indeed generous, 3 times the property's assessed value, enough to clear Thomas's debts and provide comfortable living for his remaining years. But the catch was obvious. Reed's development company would immediately begin construction of a luxury resort complex, destroying the habitat that had drawn the cub's mother to the area in the first place. Never, Thomas said, his voice carrying the finality of absolute conviction. This land belongs to the wildlife, not to developers who see nothing but dollar signs in every tree. Reed's mask of civility slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. That's unfortunate, Dr. Mitchell. I hope you won't regret that decision. The confrontation might have escalated if not for the arrival of an unexpected ally. Sarah Chen, a young attorney from the Environmental Law Clinic in Missoula, had driven 3 hours after hearing about the case through local wildlife advocacy networks. Her appearance was deceptively unassuming, petite frame, earnest expression, clothes that suggested more time spent in libraries than courtrooms. But her eyes held the fierce intelligence of someone who never backed down from a fight. Gentlemen, she announced, pulling a thick briefcase from her compact car, I represent Dr. Mitchell in this matter. Any further communication should go through me. Sarah's legal strategy was both brilliant and desperate. She filed for a temporary restraining order, citing the cubs' dependency on their current caregivers and the potentially fatal stress of immediate relocation. She argued that Thomas and Margaret had created a bond essential to the bear's psychological development, and that separating them without proper preparation would constitute animal cruelty. The case attracted media attention that neither Thomas nor Margaret wanted. Reporters camped outside the property, transforming their quiet mountain refuge into a circus of competing narratives. Local television stations framed it as elderly man's brave rescue versus federal overreach, while national networks focused on dangerous wildlife threatens rural community. The community's response split along predictable lines. Longtime residents, many of whom had known Thomas for decades, rallied to his support with homemade signs reading "Save the Cubs" and "Thomas is a hero." But newer residents, particularly those who had moved to Glacier Ridge for its perceived safety and exclusivity, sided with Reed's demands for strict enforcement of wildlife regulations. Margaret found herself thrust into an unwelcome spotlight as reporters discovered her role in the cubs' care. Television interviews felt like interrogations as journalists probed for any angle that might generate compelling footage. Mrs. Sullivan, one particularly aggressive reporter, asked, "Don't you think it's selfish to keep these wild animals for your own emotional gratification?" The question struck Margaret like a physical blow, voicing the doubts that plagued her sleepless nights. Was their love for Rex, Luna, and Scout truly in the cubs' best interests, or were they clinging to surrogates for the children and grandchildren they'd never had? The cubs themselves seemed oblivious to the controversy swirling around them. Rex had grown into a magnificent young bear whose protective instincts now extended beyond his siblings to include Thomas and Margaret. He would position himself between his human caregivers and any perceived threat, whether it was an unfamiliar reporter or a territorial squirrel. Luna's intelligence had developed to an almost uncanny degree. She could open complex latches, solve puzzle feeders, and seem to understand human conversation with disturbing accuracy. Scout remained the most emotionally sensitive of the three, often withdrawing when tensions ran high, as if absorbing the stress that surrounded their precarious situation. The legal proceedings dragged through October and into November, each hearing bringing new arguments and counter-arguments that seemed to distance them further from any resolution. Sarah Chen fought brilliantly, citing precedents and regulations with the passion of someone who genuinely believed in their cause. But the federal prosecutors had resources and precedent on their side, and their patience for emotional appeals was wearing thin. The turning point came during a particularly contentious hearing when Scout fell seriously ill. The youngest cub had always been the most fragile, and the stress of constant disruption had weakened his immune system to the point where a simple respiratory infection became life-threatening. Thomas worked around the clock to save him, administering IV fluids and antibiotics while Margaret monitored his vital signs with the vigilance of an ICU nurse. For 72 hours, Scout's survival hung in the balance. The cub's labored breathing filled the barn with desperate sounds that tore at Thomas's heart, while Rex and Luna seemed to understand their brother's peril, maintaining a constant vigil beside his makeshift hospital bed. "If we lose him," Margaret whispered on the second night, her voice broken with exhaustion and grief, "how can we ever forgive ourselves for putting him through this?" Thomas had no answer. He sat beside Scout's prone form, one hand gently stroking the cub's fur, while the other held an oxygen mask close to his muzzle. The irony wasn't lost on him. They had saved these cubs from certain death only to watch them suffer under the weight of human bureaucracy and legal maneuvering. Scout's recovery began slowly, marked by the first full breath without wheezing, then the first attempt to lift his head, finally the weak but unmistakable sound that meant he recognized Thomas's voice. When he was strong enough to nurse from a bottle again, both Thomas and Margaret wept openly, their tears falling onto the soft fur of a creature who had become more than wildlife, more than a rescue project. He had become family. The near loss of Scout forced a reckoning that all the legal arguments had failed to achieve. Watching the cub fight for his life made it impossible to ignore the central question that had been lurking beneath every hearing and every media interview. What was truly best for Rex, Luna, and Scout? The cubs were now 6 months old, approaching the size where their natural instincts would begin asserting themselves more forcefully. Rex already showed signs of the territorial behavior that would eventually make him unsuitable for human contact. Luna's curiosity was leading her to test boundaries that wouldn't exist in the wild. Even Scout, despite his gentle nature, was developing the strength that could inadvertently harm the humans he loved. Sarah Chen delivered the news that everyone had been dreading but expecting. The federal court had ruled in favor of immediate relocation. The cubs would be transported to the rehabilitation facility within 2 weeks, beginning a process designed to break their bonds with humans and prepare them for eventual release into the wild. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, her professional composure cracking to reveal the genuine emotion beneath. "We knew this was likely from the beginning. The law is clear, even when the heart isn't." Thomas nodded, understanding that their legal fight had been more about buying time than winning a permanent victory. The extra months had allowed the cubs to grow stronger, more capable of surviving the transition ahead. But it also meant the bonds they'd formed had grown deeper, making the inevitable separation more painful for everyone involved. Marcus Reed's victory celebration was notably absent. The developer had achieved his legal objective, but the media attention had cast him as the villain in a story that resonated far beyond Glacier Ridge. His company's reputation had suffered, and several planned projects faced new regulatory scrutiny from environmental groups energized by the Cubs' plight. As Thomas and Margaret began the heartbreaking process of preparing Rex, Luna, and Scout for their departure, they couldn't escape the feeling that they were betraying the trust of three innocent creatures who had given them purpose, joy, and a reason to hope again. The Cubs didn't understand deadlines or court orders. They only knew that their world was about to change in ways they couldn't comprehend. December 1st arrived with the merciless punctuality of an execution date. The transport team from the State Rehabilitation Facility materialized at dawn like harbingers of an ending Thomas had tried desperately to prevent. 3 specialized vehicles formed a convoy in his driveway: a veterinary van equipped with sedation equipment, a heavy-duty truck with reinforced transport crates, and a state patrol car whose flashing lights cast ominous red and blue shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Dr. Linda Morrison, the facility's director, stepped out of the lead vehicle with the brisk efficiency of someone who had orchestrated countless wildlife relocations. Her manner was professional but not unkind, her gray hair pulled back in a practical bun that suggested decades of working with dangerous animals. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned her authority through experience rather than politics. "Dr. Mitchell," she said, extending a gloved hand, "I've heard remarkable things about your work with these cubs. The documentation you've provided will be invaluable for their continued care." Thomas shook her hand but found no comfort in her words. Behind him, Margaret stood on the porch wrapped in Eleanor's old quilt, her face pale as winter sky. She had barely slept in 3 days, spending every possible moment with the cubs, as if her presence could somehow delay the inevitable. Rex seemed to sense the change in atmosphere before any of the humans moved toward the barn. The young bear, now weighing nearly 70 pounds and standing waist-high to Thomas, began pacing with an agitation that made the transport team visibly nervous. His siblings picked up on his distress. Luna pressed herself against the far corner of their enclosure, while Scout remained close to Rex, seeking comfort from his protector. "The sedation will be administered via dart gun, Doctor," Morrison explained as her team assembled their equipment. "It's the safest method for bears this size. They'll be unconscious within minutes and will wake up safely at our facility." Thomas nodded mutely, understanding the medical necessity while hating every aspect of what was about to unfold. These cubs had never known violence or fear in their months under his care. The tranquilizer darts would be their first experience with humans as adversaries rather than protectors. The process began with clinical precision that made it somehow worse than if it had been chaotic. Dr. Morrison's assistant, a young man with gentle hands and understanding eyes, approached the enclosure while Thomas and Margaret were asked to step back. The cubs needed to see them as clearly separate from what was happening, preventing future associations between their beloved caregivers and traumatic experiences. Rex was the first target, his size and protective instincts making him the primary concern for the transport team's safety. The dart struck him in the thick muscle of his shoulder, and Thomas watched in agonized silence as confusion clouded the young bear's eyes. Rex swayed for a moment, looking directly at Thomas with an expression that seemed to ask why this was happening, before his legs buckled and he collapsed onto the soft bedding. Luna's sedation followed quickly, her smaller frame requiring a reduced dosage that still took effect with devastating efficiency. She had been investigating the strange humans with her characteristic curiosity when the dart found its mark, and her final conscious act was to crawl toward Rex's motionless form, seeking comfort even as the drugs pulled her into unconsciousness. Scout proved the most heartbreaking. The smallest and most emotionally sensitive of the 3 seemed to understand that something terrible was happening to his family. He pressed himself against the corner of the enclosure, his dark eyes wide with terror as the humans approached with their equipment. When the dart struck him, he let out a sound that was part whimper, part cry for help, a sound that would haunt Thomas's dreams for years to come. The loading process that followed was a masterpiece of professional efficiency that felt like desecration to Thomas and Margaret. Each unconscious cub was carefully examined, weighed, and photographed before being placed in individual transport crates designed to minimize stress and maximize safety. The crates were spacious enough to allow natural movement once the cubs regained consciousness, but seeing Rex, Luna, and Scout reduced to cargo broke something fundamental in the two humans who had raised them. "They'll be monitored continuously during transport," Dr. Morrison assured them as the crates were secured in the truck. "The facility is only 4 hours away, and they'll wake up in a controlled environment designed to ease the transition." Margaret couldn't watch as the truck pulled away, its precious cargo disappearing around the bend that led back to the main highway. She stood with her back to the driveway, her shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the very center of her being. Thomas placed a protective arm around her, his own tears freezing on his cheeks in the bitter morning air. The silence that followed was deeper than mere absence of sound. It was the silence of purpose withdrawn, of meaning extracted from daily routine. The barn, so recently alive with the sounds of growing bears, echoed with emptiness that pressed against them like a physical weight. The feeding schedule that had structured their days for 8 months suddenly meant nothing. The careful charts tracking weight gain and developmental milestones became monuments to a chapter that had closed with devastating finality. Thomas spent the first day wandering his property like a ghost, unable to settle into any activity that didn't somehow relate to the cubs' care. He found himself preparing bottles before remembering there was no one to feed them to. He checked the barn's temperature sensors out of habit, then stood staring at the empty enclosure until Margaret gently led him back to the house. Margaret fared no better. She had thrown herself into the cubs' care with an intensity that had rekindled her sense of purpose after years of aimless widowhood. Without them, she felt lost in a way that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with identity. Who was she if not the woman who understood Luna's specific needs or who could calm Scout's anxieties with her gentle touch? The community's response was both touching and inadequate. Neighbors brought casseroles and condolences as if someone had died, and in a way someone had. The 3 creatures who had given Thomas and Margaret a reason to hope again were gone, possibly forever. The media attention that had made their lives miserable during the legal proceedings now felt like salt in fresh wounds, with reporters calling to ask about their feelings and their plans for the future. Sheriff Rodriguez visited on the 3rd day, ostensibly to check on their welfare, but really to sit quietly with 2 people he'd known for decades and who were clearly suffering. He found them in Thomas's kitchen, staring at the untouched coffee that had grown cold while they lost themselves in memories of morning feedings and playful cubs. "You did something beautiful," he said simply. "Don't let anyone tell you different. Those cubs had 8 months of love and care that they never would have experienced otherwise." That matters. Thomas wanted to believe him, but the doubt that gnawed at his conscience was relentless. Had they been selfish to keep the cubs as long as they had? Would Rex, Luna, and Scout have been better served by immediate placement in a professional facility? The questions offered no comfort, only endless cycles of self-recrimination that served no purpose beyond extending their suffering. The first reports from the rehabilitation facility offered small comfort. All 3 cubs had awakened from sedation without complications and were eating well in their new environment. Rex had immediately established himself as the dominant bear in his age group, displaying leadership qualities that suggested successful adaptation to social hierarchy. Luna's problem-solving abilities had impressed the staff, who noted her quick mastery of increasingly complex feeding challenges. Scout, though initially withdrawn, had begun forming tentative bonds with other rescued cubs. "They're thriving," Dr. Morrison reported during her weekly phone call. "The foundation you provided has given them remarkable resilience. Many hand-raised cubs struggle with the transition to group living, but yours seem to understand that they're bears first and foremost." The praise should have felt validating, but instead it highlighted the central irony of their situation. Their success as surrogate parents was measured by how quickly Rex, Luna, and Scout could forget them and embrace their wild nature. Every positive report about the cubs' adaptation felt like evidence that their human family had been nothing more than a temporary convenience. Winter deepened around Glacier Ridge, bringing snow that covered the cubs' former enclosure and ice that made the mountain roads treacherous. Thomas found himself grateful for the isolation, as it provided an excuse to avoid the well-meaning inquiries of neighbors who couldn't understand that their concern only deepened his sense of loss. Margaret visited less frequently, their shared grief making them mirrors of each other's pain rather than sources of mutual comfort. The property felt larger somehow, as if the cubs' absence had physically expanded the distances between buildings and landmarks. Thomas's daily walks took him past the pond where Rex had learned to fish, the climbing structures where Luna had perfected her acrobatic skills, the sheltered corner where Scout had always retreated when overwhelmed. Each location had become a shrine to memories that grew more precious and painful with each passing day. Marcus Reed's development plans proceeded with the momentum of inevitability. Environmental impact studies were conducted, permits were filed, and construction crews were scheduled to begin preliminary work in the spring. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas that the very habitat that had drawn the cub's mother to his property would soon be replaced by luxury accommodations for wealthy tourists who wanted to experience nature without any of its actual risks or responsibilities. As February approached, marking 3 months since the cub's departure, Thomas received a call that changed everything. Dr. Morrison's voice carried an unusual note of excitement as she delivered news that seemed impossible. Rex, Luna, and Scout were being considered for early release into a protected wilderness area, their adaptation to wild behavior having exceeded all expectations. "We've never seen cubs transition this successfully," she explained. "Their social skills, survival instincts, and wariness of humans suggest they're ready for the final phase of rehabilitation. If the weather cooperates, we're planning to release them in April." The news should have brought celebration, but Thomas felt only a hollow ache where joy should have lived. The cubs' success meant they were becoming exactly what they were meant to be, wild bears with no need for human intervention or affection. It was the outcome he had hoped for and dreaded in equal measure, the ultimate proof that love sometimes meant letting go completely. The first signs of spring brought more than melting snow and budding aspens to Glacier Ridge. They brought Marcus Reed's construction crews and the systematic destruction of everything Thomas held sacred. The heavy machinery arrived on a gray March morning, their diesel engines shattering the mountain silence that had been Thomas's only remaining comfort through the long winter months. Thomas stood on his porch, coffee growing cold in his hands, watching bulldozers clear the meadow where Rex had taken his first tentative steps outside the barn. The ancient pines that had provided shade for generations of wildlife fell with thunderous crashes that seemed to echo through his bones. Each tree that hit the ground felt like a personal assault, another piece of his world carved away by Reed's relentless vision of progress. Margaret had stopped visiting altogether after the construction began. The sight of the environmental devastation triggered something in her that went beyond grief into a territory that frightened them both. Thomas found her one afternoon standing at the property line, staring at the clear-cut landscape with an expression so desolate that he feared for her mental stability. "They're erasing everything," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of chainsaws. "It's like Rex, Luna, and Scout never existed here at all." The financial pressure that had driven Thomas to consider Reed's original offer had intensified during the Cubs' absence. Medical bills from Margaret's heart episodes, brought on by the stress of their legal battle, had drained her savings completely. Thomas's own health was deteriorating under the weight of depression and isolation, requiring medications he couldn't afford, and specialist visits that stretched his pension to the breaking point. Reed seemed to sense their vulnerability like a predator catching the scent of wounded prey. His visits became more frequent, and his offers more insistent, each proposal carefully crafted to exploit their desperate circumstances. He no longer bothered with the pretense of neighborly concern, approaching their situation with the cold calculation of a businessman closing a deal. "Dr. Mitchell," Reed said during one particularly aggressive encounter, "you're drowning in debt while sitting on a gold mine. Your emotional attachment to this property is admirable, but it's not practical. Let me help you salvage what you can from this situation." The new offer was substantial enough to clear both Thomas's and Margaret's debts while providing modest retirement income, but it came with conditions that felt like surrender. Thomas would have to relocate at least 50 miles away, ensuring he couldn't interfere with the resort's operations. The conservation easement he had hoped to establish would be voided and the property would be available for unlimited development. "Take the weekend to think about it," Reed urged, his tone suggesting that patience was a limited commodity. "But understand that this offer expires Monday morning. After that, I'll be pursuing other options that might not be as beneficial to you." The threat was clear, even if unspoken. Reed had the resources to tie up Thomas's property in legal challenges for years, bleeding him dry through attorney fees and court costs while the construction proceeded around him. It was a chess game where Reed controlled most of the pieces, and Thomas was reduced to protecting a king that grew more vulnerable with each move. That Saturday night, Thomas sat alone in his kitchen with Reed's contract spread before him like a death warrant. The numbers made sense. They offered security and comfort for his remaining years. But signing them would mean abandoning the land where his daughter's ashes were scattered, where Eleanor had planted her beloved garden, where 3 orphaned cubs had learned to trust humans enough to accept love and care. The decision became moot when Thomas discovered Margaret's body on Sunday morning. She had driven to the property during the night, something she hadn't done since the cubs' departure. Thomas found her sitting peacefully in her car at the edge of what had once been the cubs' favorite playing meadow, now a muddy scar carved by heavy machinery. The empty bottle of sleeping pills on the passenger seat told a story that no suicide note could have expressed more clearly. The paramedics pronounced her dead at the scene, estimating that she had been gone for several hours. Sheriff Rodriguez handled the investigation with the gentle efficiency of someone who understood that Margaret's death was less suicide than surrender, the final act of a woman who had simply run out of reasons to endure the pain of existing in a world that seemed designed to destroy everything she loved. Thomas stood beside the ambulance as they loaded Margaret's body, feeling something essential break inside his chest. She had been more than a neighbor or friend. She had become family through their shared devotion to Rex, Luna, and Scout. Her death felt like losing a sister he had discovered too late, a partner in grief who understood his losses because they mirrored her own. The funeral was a small affair attended by the dwindling community of longtime Glacier Ridge residents who remembered Margaret as the nurse who had delivered their children and tended their elderly parents. Thomas delivered a eulogy that focused on her compassion and dedication, carefully avoiding any mention of the cubs whose care had given her life meaning in her final months. "Margaret Sullivan died of a broken heart," he said simply, his words carrying across the small cemetery where Eleanor was also buried. "She loved completely and lost everything, and when there was nothing left to love, she chose peace over pain." Reed attended the funeral with the practiced solemnity of a politician making necessary appearances. His presence felt obscene to Thomas, a reminder that Margaret's death was just another variable in his development equation. After the service, Reed approached with condolences that sounded rehearsed, and an observation that made Thomas's blood run cold. "This tragedy could have been prevented," Reed said quietly, his words carrying just enough sympathy to mask their essential cruelty. "Margaret didn't need to suffer like this." "Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is accept change rather than fighting it." Thomas wanted to strike him, to release the rage that had been building through months of loss and frustration. But Margaret's death had drained something vital from his spirit, leaving him too empty for anger, too exhausted for the fight that Reed clearly wanted to provoke. That night, Thomas sat in his kitchen with Reed's contract once again, Margaret's funeral program beside it as a reminder of where resistance had led. The house felt impossibly large without her presence, the silence broken only by the distant sound of construction equipment that worked around the clock to meet Reed's aggressive timeline. He was reaching for a pen when the phone rang. Dr. Morrison's voice carried excitement that seemed offensive in the wake of Margaret's death. News about the Cubs' progress that felt irrelevant to his current reality. "Dr. Mitchell, I have wonderful news," she said. "Rex, Luna, and Scout are being released next week. Their adaptation has been phenomenal. They're showing all the behaviors we hope to see in successfully rehabilitated bears. They'll be transported to the Glacier Bay Wilderness area, where they'll have thousands of acres of pristine habitat." Thomas listened numbly as Dr. Morrison described the release process, the monitoring protocols, and the optimistic projections for the cubs' survival in the wild. They had become statistics in a conservation success story, their individual personalities reduced to data points that prove the effectiveness of professional rehabilitation programs. "Would you like to observe the release?" Dr. Morrison asked. "We usually don't allow public viewing, but given your role in their early care, I think we could make an exception." The invitation should have brought joy or at least curiosity about the cubs' fate, but Thomas felt only a profound indifference. Rex, Luna, and Scout had moved beyond his influence into a world where his love and sacrifice meant nothing. They were wild bears now, shaped by instincts older than human civilization, and his presence at their release would be as meaningless as his absence. "Thank you," he said, "but I think it's better if they begin their new lives without any reminders of their old ones." After hanging up, Thomas signed Reed's contract with the mechanical precision of a man completing a necessary but distasteful task. The property would be sold. The wildlife habitat would disappear under concrete and steel, and he would relocate to a retirement community where his memories could fade quietly without the constant reminder of everything he had lost. The cubs would be free, Margaret would be at peace, and Thomas would finally stop fighting a war he had never been equipped to win. The revelation came 3 days before Thomas was scheduled to vacate the property, delivered by an unlikely messenger who shattered everything he thought he knew about Margaret's death and Marcus Reed's true motivations. Sarah Chen, the environmental lawyer who had fought so fiercely for the cubs' custody, arrived at his door with a manila envelope that trembled in her hands, and news that would change the trajectory of his grief. "Dr. Mitchell," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion, "Margaret didn't kill herself. She was murdered." Thomas stared at her through the screen door, his mind struggling to process words that seemed to exist in a different universe from the reality he had accepted. Margaret's suicide had felt inevitable in retrospect, a logical conclusion to months of accumulated loss and disappointment. The alternative Sarah suggested felt impossible, too malevolent for the rural Montana community where violent crime was virtually unknown. "That's impossible," he said, but even as the words left his mouth he felt something shift in his understanding of recent events. Margaret's body position in the car, The convenient timing of her death just as Reed's pressure intensified, the complete absence of any warning signs or preparation that typically preceded suicide. Sarah pushed past him into the kitchen, spreading photographs and documents across the table with the urgency of someone racing against time. The evidence she presented was damning. Margaret's fingerprints were absent from the pill bottle found in her car, the sleeping medication wasn't prescribed to her by any local physician, and security footage from the highway showed a second vehicle following her car that night, a vehicle registered to Reed Development Corporation. The medical examiner was pressured to rule it suicide, Sarah explained, her hands shaking as she pointed to inconsistencies in the official report. Margaret's blood showed levels of sedatives that would have made conscious pill-taking impossible. She was drugged first, then positioned in the car to make it look self-inflicted. The truth unfolded like a nightmare gaining substance in daylight. Reed had orchestrated Margaret's murder as the final pressure point needed to break Thomas's resistance to selling the property. With Margaret gone and Thomas isolated in his grief, Reed assumed the old man would accept his offer without further opposition. It was a calculated gamble based on psychological manipulation rather than pure business negotiation. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Thomas asked, his voice hollow with the weight of implications he was only beginning to grasp. Sarah's expression crumbled with shame and fear. "I was threatened. Reed's people made it clear that my law practice would be destroyed if I pursued any investigation into Margaret's death. I convinced myself that your grief was more important than abstract justice. I was wrong." The photographs she spread before him showed a different version of that terrible night. Surveillance images from a gas station 20 miles away, where Margaret's car had stopped and a man matching Reed's description had approached her vehicle. Additional images showed the same man purchasing items consistent with the murder weapon, over-the-counter sleeping pills and a syringe that could have been used for forced injection. Thomas studied the evidence with the clinical detachment of someone whose emotional reserves had been completely depleted. Margaret's murder should have triggered rage or demands for immediate justice, but he felt only a profound sadness that seemed to encompass not just her death, but the entire sequence of events that had led to this moment. "The FBI is opening an investigation," Sarah continued, "but they need your cooperation. You're the only person who can provide context for Reed's escalating pressure campaign and his motives for eliminating Margaret as an obstacle to his development plans." As if summoned by their conversation about him, Reed's silver Mercedes pulled into the driveway with the confident swagger of a man checking on his latest acquisition. He emerged from the car wearing the satisfied expression of someone who believed he had successfully orchestrated a complex criminal enterprise without leaving any traceable evidence. "Dr. Mitchell," Reed called out, approaching the house with papers that presumably represented the final transfer documents. "I trust you're ready to finalize our agreement. I've brought a moving truck to help you relocate your personal items." Thomas stood slowly, feeling Sarah's eyes on him as he walked toward the door. Reed's presence on the property where Margaret had been murdered felt like a violation that demanded response, but the old veterinarian found himself strangely calm as he contemplated the man who had destroyed everything he valued. "Marcus," Thomas said, opening the door wider than necessary, "please come in. I'd like you to meet someone." Reed entered with the casual confidence of a predator in familiar territory, his smile faltering only when he noticed Sarah's presence and the documents spread across the kitchen table. The moment of recognition was subtle but unmistakable. Reed understood immediately that his carefully constructed narrative was unraveling. "Dr. Mitchell," Reed said, his voice taking on a cautious tone, "I wasn't aware you were conducting business with other parties. I thought we had an exclusive agreement." Sarah rose from her chair with the measured precision of a prosecutor preparing to present evidence to a jury. "Mr. Reed, I'm Sarah Chen, attorney for Dr." Mitchell and the estate of Margaret Sullivan. I believe you knew Ms. Sullivan quite well before her untimely death." The verbal sparring that followed was a masterpiece of legal maneuvering disguised as polite conversation. Sarah presented her evidence in carefully measured doses, watching Reed's expressions for any tell that might confirm or deny her accusations. Reed, for his part, maintained the facade of innocent confusion, even as his legal training undoubtedly catalogued the implications of each revelation. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you're suggesting," Reed said, but his hand moved unconsciously to his phone, perhaps calculating whether he could summon his own attorneys quickly enough to contain the situation. Thomas watched the exchange with detached fascination, observing the moment when Reed realized that his perfect crime had been compromised by evidence he hadn't anticipated. The developer's confident exterior began to crack, revealing glimpses of the desperate man underneath who had gambled everything on a real estate deal that required murder to succeed. The breakthrough came when Sarah produced the gas station surveillance footage on her laptop, the images clear enough to identify Reed's face and vehicle. His expression shifted from denial to calculation, to something approaching panic as he understood that his presence near Margaret's car on the night of her death couldn't be explained away as coincidence. "That proves nothing," Reed said, but his voice carried the hollow ring of a man who knew his defenses were crumbling. "I was in the area on business. If I encountered Miss Sullivan, it was purely by chance." Sarah's response was delivered with the precision of a surgeon making a critical incision. "Mr. Reed, we also have testimony from the pharmacy where you purchased the sleeping medication found in Margaret's system. The clerk remembers your unusual request for specific brands not typically sold to the general public." The facade collapsed completely as Reed understood that his web of evidence had been thoroughly unraveled. His shoulders sagged with the weight of inevitable exposure, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the bitter resignation of a gambler who had lost everything on a single roll of the dice. "You don't understand the pressure I was under," he said, the words tumbling out with the desperate urgency of a confession. "The investors were threatening to pull out if I couldn't deliver the property by the deadline. Margaret was poisoning Thomas against any reasonable negotiation. She had to be removed from the equation." Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest as Reed's admission confirmed Margaret's murder while simultaneously reducing her to a business obstacle that required elimination. The casual nature of Reed's justification, describing murder as merely removing someone from an equation, revealed a moral emptiness that was perhaps more disturbing than the crime itself. Sarah was recording the conversation on her phone, capturing Reed's confession with the patient professionalism of someone who understood the legal weight of spontaneous admissions. Reed seemed oblivious to his legal jeopardy, focused instead on justifying his actions to an audience that would never accept his reasoning. "She was dying anyway," Reed continued, his desperation making him cruel. "The heart condition would have killed her within months. I simply accelerated the inevitable while solving a business problem that was costing millions in development delays." The confession continued for another 10 minutes, Reed's need to justify his actions overriding any sense of self-preservation. When Sheriff Rodriguez arrived with federal agents summoned by Sarah's earlier call, they found Reed still talking, still explaining why Margaret's murder had been a necessary component of his business plan. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Reed looked directly at Thomas with an expression that might have been remorse or simply frustration at being caught. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt," he said. "This was supposed to be a simple real estate transaction." Thomas watched the arrest with the same detached calm he had maintained throughout the revelations, feeling as if he were observing events happening to someone else entirely. Justice for Margaret's murder should have brought satisfaction or closure, but he felt only an overwhelming emptiness where emotions should have resided. The autumn wind carried a familiar scent across Thomas's property as he stood on the porch that had witnessed so much joy and sorrow over the past 18 months. At 73, he moved with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned to appreciate each day as an unexpected gift, his recovery from the dark months following Margaret's murder having been as gradual and surprising as the changing seasons themselves. The property had been transformed in the months since Reed's arrest and conviction. Federal investigators had frozen Reed Development Corporation's assets, effectively ending the resort project and returning the cleared land to Thomas's stewardship. With financial assistance from an unexpected source, a trust fund Margaret had secretly established using her late husband's life insurance, Thomas had begun the slow process of ecological restoration. Young aspens now grew where bulldozers had once carved destructive paths, their golden leaves catching the afternoon light like nature's own celebration of resilience. The meadow where Margaret had died had been replanted with wild flowers she had mentioned loving, creating a living memorial that honored her memory while providing habitat for the wildlife she had helped protect. Thomas was examining the progress of newly planted pine seedlings when he first noticed the tracks, bear prints in the soft earth near the creek, larger than any he remembered from the cub's youth, but familiar in a way that made his heart quicken with possibilities he barely dared to acknowledge. The tracks were fresh, perhaps a day old, and they followed a path that seemed deliberately chosen to be visible from the house. Over the following weeks, the signs multiplied. Fish bones appeared on the old feeding rock where Rex had learned to eat solid food. Claw marks on the ancient oak suggested a bear had been marking territory in a pattern that seemed both protective and commemorative. Most intriguingly, someone or something had been leaving offerings at the edge of the meadow, perfectly arranged piles of berries and pine nuts that couldn't be explained by wind or coincidence. Sheriff Rodriguez, now a close friend rather than merely a law enforcement contact, visited regularly to check on Thomas's welfare and marvel at the property's transformation. During one such visit, he mentioned unusual reports from other residents about bear sightings that defied normal wildlife behavior patterns. 3 bears traveling together, he said, shaking his head with bemused confusion. Not a mother with cubs, but 3 adult bears that seem to coordinate their movements like they're following some kind of plan. Fish and Wildlife says it's unprecedented for the region. Thomas felt his pulse quicken, but maintained careful neutrality in his response. The possibility that Rex, Luna, and Scout had returned to their birthplace seemed too miraculous to voice aloud, too fragile a hope to expose to skepticism or scientific analysis. Instead, he filed away each new piece of evidence like a detective working a case that mattered more than life itself. The revelation came on a crisp October evening when Thomas was sitting on his porch reading one of Eleanor's favorite novels, a ritual that had become his way of honoring both the woman he had loved for 40 years and the quieter companionship he had discovered with Margaret. The book, a story about family bonds that transcend conventional boundaries, seemed prophetic when he looked up to see 3 massive black bears emerging from the tree line. They moved with the confident grace of animals in their prime, their massive frames testimony to successful adaptation to wilderness life. But it was their approach pattern that confirmed what Thomas's heart had already recognized, the largest bear leading with protective awareness, the second displaying intelligent curiosity about the changed landscape, the third hanging back with the cautious sensitivity that had always characterized Scout. Rex had grown into a magnificent specimen, easily 400 pounds of muscle and power, his distinctive facial markings now framed by the broader features of full maturity. Luna's intelligence was evident in her systematic investigation of the property, her movements methodical as she catalogued changes and continuities with scientific precision. Scout remained the emotional barometer of the group, his wariness gradually melting into something approaching recognition as familiar scents triggered memories of safety and love. Thomas remained motionless on the porch, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter the miracle unfolding before him. The bears approached with deliberate slowness, testing each step for signs of danger or welcome, their wild instincts warring with deeper memories that pulled them toward the human who had shaped their earliest understanding of safety and family. The moment of true recognition came when Rex reached the edge of the porch and raised his massive head to meet Thomas's eyes. The bear's expression carried intelligence that transcended species boundaries, acknowledgement that bridged the gap between wild animal and beloved surrogate child. When Rex slowly lowered his head in what could only be described as a bow, Thomas felt tears streaming down his cheeks. "Hello, my boy," he whispered, his voice carrying across the silence that had fallen over the mountain landscape. Welcome home. What followed was a reunion that defied every principle of wildlife management and human-animal interaction protocols. Luna approached with her characteristic curiosity, sniffing Thomas's extended hand before gently pressing her massive head against his palm. Scout required more time, circling the porch twice before finally accepting that this was indeed the human who had saved them from death and taught them to trust in love's possibility. The bears spent 3 hours on the property that evening, investigating the restoration work with apparent approval, marking territorial boundaries that seemed designed to protect rather than claim, and demonstrating through their behavior that their return was intentional rather than coincidental. When they finally departed into the gathering darkness, Thomas understood that they had come not just to visit, but to deliver a message. Over the following months, the pattern became established. The bears would appear every few weeks, sometimes individually, but more often as a group, their visits timed to coincide with Thomas's evening routine on the porch. They brought gifts, unusual stones, perfectly preserved feathers, once a piece of antler carved by natural processes into something resembling sculpture. These offerings accumulated on the porch railing like tokens of affection from children who had grown up but never forgotten their father's love. The scientific community remained baffled by reports of the bears' behavior, but Thomas felt no need to seek official validation for what he experienced. Rex, Luna, and Scout had returned to express gratitude in the only way their wild natures allowed, honoring the bond that had saved their lives while respecting the boundaries that allowed them to remain free. As winter approached, Thomas established a new routine that incorporated his cub's return into his daily life. Each evening he would sit on the porch with a cup of tea and one of Eleanor's books, available but not demanding, present but not intrusive. Sometimes the bears would appear, sometimes they wouldn't, but the possibility of their presence had restored a sense of purpose that made each day worth experiencing. The property that had once faced destruction had become a sanctuary, where love transcended species, where family bonds proved stronger than time or distance, and where an old man learned that some gifts return to us in forms we never expected but always needed. Sometimes, life teaches us that family isn't defined by blood, but by love that transcends every boundary we thought existed. Dr. Thomas Mitchell discovered this truth when 3 orphaned bear cubs taught him that the deepest connections often come when we least expect them, and that the bonds we forge through sacrifice and unconditional care create a legacy that endures long after we think all hope is lost. In a world that often tells us our best years are behind us, Thomas's story reminds us that purpose, meaning, and profound joy can arrive at any moment, sometimes in the smallest, most vulnerable packages that need exactly what we have to give. His journey from grief-stricken widower to surrogate father to beloved protector shows us that love multiplies when shared, that taking care of others heals our own broken hearts, and that the family we choose to create through acts of compassion becomes just as powerful as the one we were born into. For those of us navigating the complex emotions of later life, dealing with loss, questioning our relevance, wondering if our capacity to love and be loved has passed, Thomas's reunion with Rex, Luna, and Scout offers hope that our greatest chapters of connection and purpose may still be waiting to unfold. What unexpected family has brought meaning to your life in ways you never anticipated? Have you ever experienced a moment where caring for someone or something else helped heal your own heart? Share your stories in the comments below. We'd love to hear how love found you when you needed it most. The years that followed Rex, Luna, and Scout's return transformed Thomas's existence from mere survival into something approaching contentment. At 75, he had developed the kind of peace that comes not from avoiding life's difficulties, but from having survived them with grace and discovering unexpected gifts on the other side of loss. The property had become a recognized wildlife sanctuary, officially protected through conservation easements that ensured its preservation long after Thomas's death. The Montana Department of Fish Wildlife Parks had initially been skeptical of reports about the unusual bear behavior, but repeated documentation by wildlife cameras had convinced even the most hardened skeptics that something extraordinary was occurring on the old veterinarian's land. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a wildlife behaviorist from the University of Montana, had been studying the bears' visits for 2 years, her research focusing on the unprecedented demonstration of long-term memory and emotional attachment in wild black bears. Her published papers had brought international attention to Thomas's story, though he remained reluctant to embrace the celebrity that accompanied scientific validation. What you've documented here challenges everything we thought we knew about human-animal bonding, Dr. Walsh explained during one of her regular observation sessions. Rex, Luna, and Scout display behaviors typically associated with domesticated animals, yet they maintain their wild instincts and territorial boundaries. It's as if they've created a hybrid relationship that shouldn't exist in nature. Thomas appreciated the scientific interest, but found the academic analysis somewhat beside the point. The bear's return wasn't a phenomenon to be studied, but a gift to be treasured. A daily reminder that love creates connections stronger than logic or biological programming. He had long since stopped questioning the miracle and focused instead on honoring it through careful stewardship of the land that had brought them all together. The sanctuary attracted visitors from around the world, wildlife enthusiasts, researchers, and increasing numbers of elderly individuals who found hope in Thomas's story of renewal and unexpected family. He had reluctantly agreed to give monthly tours, sharing his experience with groups small enough to avoid disturbing the bears' natural patterns. "People ask me if I'm lonely out here," Thomas would tell these visitors as they stood in the meadow where Margaret's wildflowers now bloomed in spectacular profusion. "But how can I be lonely when I'm surrounded by so much love? It just comes in forms I never expected when I was younger." The tours had an unexpected benefit. They connected Thomas with other people navigating the challenges of aging, loss, and the search for meaning in life's later chapters. Many visitors shared their own stories of unexpected connections, substitute families, and the ways that caring for others had given their lives renewed purpose. Eleanor Martinez, a retired teacher from Arizona, had become a regular correspondent after visiting the sanctuary the previous spring. Her weekly letters described her work with rescued horses, drawing parallels between Thomas's bears and her own discoveries about the healing power of interspecies relationships. "Your Rex, Luna, and Scout remind me that love doesn't diminish with age," she wrote in one particularly moving letter. "If anything, we become better at recognizing it when it appears, because we understand how precious and rare it really is." The bears themselves had established territories that encompassed the sanctuary while extending into the surrounding national forest. Rex had mated with a wild female and produced two cubs, establishing a genetic legacy that ensured the family line would continue. Luna's intelligence had made her something of a legend among local wildlife officials, who reported increasingly sophisticated problem-solving behaviors that suggested exceptional cognitive development. Scout remained the most connected to Thomas, often appearing alone during the old man's evening reading sessions, as if understanding that some bonds required privacy to flourish properly. The seasonal rhythm of their visits had become the organizing principle of Thomas's life. Spring brought energetic appearances as the bears emerged from winter dens with new cubs to introduce. Summer visits were more casual, brief acknowledgments during evening forays that demonstrated the property remained under protective watch. Fall brought the most meaningful encounters, extended sessions that seemed designed to prepare for winter separation, with gifts exchanged and bonds renewed before the long months of hibernation. Thomas had begun writing his memoirs at the encouragement of visitors who insisted his story needed preservation for future generations. The process of documenting his journey from grief-stricken widower to sanctuary keeper had revealed patterns and meanings he hadn't recognized while living through the experiences themselves. "I thought my life was ending when Eleanor died," he wrote in one particularly reflective passage. "Then Margaret's arrival brought companionship I hadn't dared hope for, and the cubs gave us both a purpose that transformed grief into joy. Margaret's murder nearly destroyed me completely, but the bear's return taught me that love creates bonds stronger than death, connections that endure beyond any single lifetime." The writing project had attracted interest from publishers, but Thomas remained uncertain about sharing his most private experiences with a broader audience. The story felt too sacred for commercial exploitation, too personal for the kind of marketing that publishing required. Instead, he had begun creating a private archive, photographs, videos, and written accounts that could be preserved at the local historical society for future researchers and families dealing with similar losses. Dr. Walsh had proposed expanding the research to include other cases of long-term human-animal bonding, but Thomas had declined to participate in broader studies. His relationship with Rex, Luna, and Scout wasn't a scientific phenomenon, but a family connection that deserved protection from academic scrutiny. The bears had given him everything he needed to understand about love's persistence and power. No further analysis was necessary. As autumn deepened into the approach of another winter, Thomas found himself reflecting on the cyclical nature of his contentment. The bears would soon retreat to their dens, leaving him with months of anticipation for their spring return. But the solitude no longer felt like abandonment. It had become preparation, a time for reflection and gratitude that made their eventual reunion more precious. Sitting on his porch with evening tea and one of Eleanor's novels, Thomas watched the sun set behind mountains that had witnessed his transformation from broken man to grateful survivor. Somewhere in those peaks, Rex, Luna, and Scout were beginning their preparations for winter sleep, carrying with them the certainty that spring would bring another reunion with the human who had taught them that love transcends every boundary nature thought it had established. The story wasn't ending, it was simply pausing, gathering strength for the next chapter of an impossible family that had somehow learned to flourish in the space between wild and domestic, between human and animal, between loss and hope.